There are lots of reasons why you might choose to play a certain game, but when it comes to local co-op games, there just aren't that many options out there. So lots of times my wife and I will play a game purely because it has a local co-op mode, even if we know nothing else about it. The gamble doesn't always pay off, but sometimes we unearth some seriously great hidden gems. I'm Randy from Gaming Gig, and today's review is on Cat Quest 2 played in co-op in 2023. When I first saw Cat Quest 2, I more or less completely wrote it off. The cartoony visuals combined with the pet-focused theme screamed low-budget kids game to me. But I kept seeing the game come up on lists of great co-op games, so eventually we decided to try it out. We discovered that Cat Quest 2 is a straightforward, legitimate action RPG that just happens to employ a very cutesy art style. Once I got used to it, I actually ended up really enjoying this art style, but it did take me a bit to get over my preconceived notions of what I expected from the game. The overall tone of Cat Quest 2 is actually extremely humorous. Every bit of text, from the dialogue to the town names, is filled to the brim with puns about pets. You'd think it would get old being constantly fed pet puns, but the writers were so impressively dedicated to the bit that it actually ends up working. Cat Quest 2 can absolutely be played solo. In fact, a lot of the reviews I've seen for the game were from people who played it single player, and it seemed like they had a really great time. But to me, it seems like they developed this game with co-op play in mind as the intended experience. There are two main characters, a cat and a dog, who need to work together to reclaim their kingdoms. If played in single player, you can swap back and forth between the characters, and an AI will control whichever character you don't have selected. But in co-op mode, each of the two players have their own dedicated character to control. The primary thing you do in this game is real-time combat. It's super approachable and simple to grasp. One button for attacking with your weapon, one button for a dodge, and the shoulder and trigger buttons can have magic attacks assigned to them. Battles take place either on the overworld or within cave dungeons. Enemy attacks are always clearly telegraphed, so knowing when to attack and when to dodge and get out of the way is pretty straightforward and easy to learn. Things can become pretty hectic when you're taking on a group of enemies, but nothing ever feels overwhelming or unfair. The simplicity of the combat makes this a great game for newcomers to RPGs, or even just newcomers to gaming in general. But just because it's simple doesn't mean it's not fun or engaging. Even seasoned gamers can have a blast tearing their way through groups of enemies. You don't have to be amazing at the game to be successful, but the better you are, the more satisfying and efficient the combat becomes. If you're playing in co-op, having one teammate that's more experienced actually works really well. The more experienced player will naturally take a larger piece of the combat pie, making the game more challenging for them while also easing the pressure on the less experienced player. Essentially, it balances the difficulty curve for each person. As you play the game, you'll find and unlock new weapons, magic abilities, and armor that you can assign to your characters. And of course, this is an RPG, so I don't even have to tell you that everything can be upgraded and made stronger. All of the upgrading is done in a super clean and straightforward way though, meaning that this game doesn't overload you with copious amounts of overwhelming menus. The developers have done a really great job of creating an RPG that minimizes player frustration. For example, every main quest, side quest, and dungeon is clearly labeled with a suggested level. I know this isn't revolutionary or anything, many RPGs do this, but what makes it really great in Cat Quest 2 is that the level recommendations actually matter and work as solid guidelines. In our playthrough, we would sometimes attempt a quest that was a few levels higher than where we were at, and we found that it almost always ended poorly for us. However, when we tackled quests that were at or below our current level, we were almost always successful. This may seem extremely mundane, but if you've played your fair share of RPGs, you know how meaningless these level recommendations on quests sometimes are. It's super refreshing to play a game that actually implements this feature properly. If you follow the level recommendations, you'll never be frustrated and you'll always know if you're ready for a challenge or not. There's a decent story in this game that we enjoyed, but like I mentioned earlier, the bulk of the time is spent in combat. There's not many cutscenes, and the story isn't a huge part of the overall experience. I actually don't mind a whole lot of action, but it does bring me to our only real complaint, which is the fact that by the end of the game, the combat does start to feel somewhat repetitive. The game mitigates this by adding elements along the way, like new magic abilities, new enemy types, and more difficult encounters, but still, things eventually do feel a little samey. This is a very minor complaint though, because admittedly, it's a problem that a lot of combat-heavy games suffer from. On the plus side, at least the game does a good job of keeping you in the action, even if the action doesn't always feel completely fresh and new. Another thing to mention is that, although we didn't personally feel this way, if you're a die-hard fan of RPGs, you might find Cat Quest 2 to be a little simplistic. And I think it's a fair critique, because I do think that this game is meant to be more approachable than the typical action RPG. But that means it's the perfect game for newcomers, and because it has a great co-op mode, it can be an awesome way to introduce a friend or family member to the world of RPGs. I love cooperative gaming, and I think that games like this are really important when it comes to creating new gaming enthusiasts. Gaming in general, but especially RPGs, can be intimidating, and having someone along for the ride can make all the difference. So that's Cat Quest 2. I'd love to know your thoughts in the comments. If you enjoyed this review, make sure to leave us a like. I'm Randy from Gaming Gig, and I'll see you next time.